Jason Coleman lay motionless in the hospital bed, his eyes closed but his mind racing. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, a rhythmic reminder that he was still alive. Outside, the faint hum of traffic drifted through the partially open window, blending with the occasional rustle of papers as nurses bustled about their duties. To anyone who walked into the room, Jason appeared to be in a deep coma, unconscious and unaware of the world around him. But inside, his thoughts churned with purpose and calculation. It had been 3 days since the accident, or rather, the staged accident. Jason, a self-made millionaire with a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless, had orchestrated the entire scenario. He wasn't injured beyond a few minor scrapes and bruises, but he had convinced everyone, including the doctors, that he was far worse off than he let on. The car crash had been real enough. He'd hired a stunt driver to ram his luxury sedan at just the right angle to make it look authentic without causing any real harm. What followed? The paramedics rushing him to the hospital, the flurry of tests and scans, was all part of the plan. Jason's decision to fake a coma wasn't born out of paranoia alone. Over the years, he had built a vast empire in the tech industry, amassing wealth and influence that made people either fear or envy him. His family, once close-knit, had grown distant, replaced by opportunists eager to get their hands on his fortune. Even his business partners, men and women he had trusted for years, seemed more interested in his money than in him as a person. The idea of pretending to be comatose came to him during one particularly tense board meeting, when he realized how little loyalty he truly commanded. If he wanted to know who would stand by him when he was at his most vulnerable, this was the only way to find out. The hospital room was quiet now, save for the soft footsteps of the nurse assigned to his care. Rachel Dawson entered silently, her sneakers making barely a sound against the tiled floor. She was in her early 30s with warm brown eyes and hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. Her uniform was crisp and she carried herself with an air of calm professionalism. Yet there was something else about her, a gentleness that set her apart from the other staff members. Jason had noticed it immediately, even before he decided to play dead. Rachel approached the bed cautiously, glancing at the monitors to ensure everything was functioning properly. Satisfied, she adjusted the IV drip and straightened the blanket covering Jason's chest. For a moment, she stood there, staring down at him. Jason could feel her gaze, though he kept his breathing steady, and his expression blank. Then, almost imperceptibly, she sighed and turned away. "Good morning, Mr. Coleman," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you can hear me somewhere in there. It's Rachel again. I've been taking care of you since you arrived." Jason's ears perked up. He hadn't expected her to talk to him like this. Not so soon, anyway. Most nurses treated comatose patients as if they were empty vessels, devoid of consciousness. But Rachel spoke as though she believed he might actually understand her. There was no condescension in her tone, only sincerity. "I don't know much about what happened to you," she continued, moving to the small desk near the window where she jotted notes on his chart. "They say you were in a car accident. That must have been terrifying. I mean, not that you remember it, obviously." She paused, tapping the pen against the clipboard. "But I imagine it would be scary, waking up in a place like this, surrounded by strangers." For a brief moment, Jason felt a pang of guilt. Here she was, pouring her energy into caring for someone she thought was helpless, while he listened intently, pretending to be oblivious. Still, he reminded himself why he was doing this. He needed answers, and Rachel was merely a pawn in the larger game he was playing. Over the next hour, Rachel went about her routine, checking his vitals, adjusting the oxygen levels, and tidying up the room. Every so often she would glance at him, her brow furrowing slightly as though she were trying to decipher some hidden meaning in his stillness. When she finally sat down in the chair beside his bed, Jason braced himself for another monologue. "You're lucky, you know," she said after a while. "Not many people have the kind of support system you do. Your brother came by yesterday and your lawyer too. They seem really worried about you." "Well," she hesitated, then added, "at least they act like they are." Jason's stomach tightened. So, Kevin had already shown up. His younger brother had always been jealous of his success, resentful of the fact that Jason had built something from nothing while Kevin struggled to hold down even the simplest jobs. And Daniel Pierce, his lawyer? The man was sharp, cunning, and utterly loyal to whoever paid him the most. Hearing Rachel mention them reignited Jason's determination to see this charade through to the end. But I guess you already knew that, Rachel mused, leaning back in her chair. People always show their true colors when they think no one's watching. Not that I blame them. Everyone has their reasons, right? Her words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Jason wondered what she meant by that. Was she referring to his visitors, or was she speaking from personal experience? He couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in her voice, the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her scrubs. There was a story there, buried beneath her composed exterior, waiting to be uncovered. As the hours passed, Jason found himself growing increasingly intrigued by Rachel. She wasn't like the others. His family, his colleagues, the countless acquaintances who orbited his life like satellites desperate for scraps of his attention. She didn't fawn over him or try to curry favor. Instead, she treated him with a quiet respect, as though he were a person rather than a paycheck. It was disarming, to say the least. By late afternoon, the room was bathed in golden sunlight streaming through the blinds. Rachel stood by the window, gazing outside as if lost in thought. Jason watched her reflection in the glass, studying the subtle shifts in her expression. Finally, she turned back toward him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Well, Mr. Coleman," she said, picking up her clipboard, "that's all for today. I'll be back tomorrow morning to check on you. Try to get some rest, okay?" With that, she left the room, closing the door gently behind her. Jason exhaled slowly, the tension in his body easing as the silence enveloped him once more. He replayed her words in his mind, dissecting each phrase for hidden meaning. Though he had started this elaborate ruse to expose the truth about those around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel Dawson might turn out to be the most surprising revelation of all. For now, however, he resolved to stay patient. The game was just beginning, and he intended to play it until the very last move. The next morning, Jason woke up to the sound of hushed voices outside his hospital room. He kept his eyes closed, feigning unconsciousness as he strained to listen. It wasn't hard to recognize the first voice. It belonged to Kevin Coleman, his younger brother. The second voice was deeper, more polished, and unmistakably that of Daniel Pierce, Jason's lawyer. They were standing just outside the door, their tones low but tinged with urgency. "I don't care what you think is best," Kevin hissed, his frustration evident. "We need to settle this now while he's out of commission. If we wait until he wakes up, he'll change everything." "Calm down," Daniel replied, his voice smooth and measured. "You're jumping the gun. For all we know, he might not wake up at all, and even if he does, it's not like he can challenge anything without proof. We just have to be smart about this." Jason clenched his fists under the blanket, his jaw tightening. He had suspected Kevin's greed for years, but hearing it confirmed, in such blatant terms, made his blood boil. As for Daniel, the man's loyalty had always been questionable. Jason paid him handsomely, yet here he was, conspiring behind his back. It was exactly the kind of betrayal he had anticipated, though. It still stung more than he cared to admit. The door creaked open and the two men stepped inside. Kevin glanced at Jason briefly before turning his attention to Daniel, who pulled a folder from his briefcase. "Let's go over the details again," Daniel said, spreading papers across the small table near the window. "If we file the paperwork, now we can secure control of his assets until he regains consciousness, or indefinitely, depending on how things play out." Kevin nodded eagerly, his eyes darting around the room as though he expected someone to walk in and catch them. "What about Rachel?" he asked suddenly. "She's been spending a lot of time in here. Do you think she suspects anything?" "She's just a nurse," Daniel dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Even if she did suspect something, she wouldn't dare say anything. People like her don't rock the boat. Not when they're working paycheck to paycheck. Jason's mind raced. So they knew about Rachel. That meant they were keeping tabs on her, probably watching her every move. He couldn't risk tipping them off, not when he was so close to uncovering the full extent of their plans. For now, he would have to stay silent and let them believe they were in control. After a few minutes, Kevin and Daniel left the room, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts. He replayed their conversation in his head, memorizing every detail. Their scheme was clear. They wanted to take over his business and fortune while he was incapacitated. But Jason wasn't about to let that happen. He had built his empire from scratch, and he wasn't going to lose it because of his brother's jealousy or his lawyer's greed. A short while later, Rachel entered the room, carrying a tray with fresh bandages and a bottle of antiseptic. She greeted him warmly, unaware of the storm brewing just moments before. "Good morning, Mr. Coleman," she said, setting the tray down on the bedside table. "I hope you slept well. I know hospitals aren't exactly comfortable, but I try to make things as pleasant as possible." Jason remained still, though his mind was anything but calm. He watched her through slitted eyelids as she worked, her movements precise and deliberate. There was something soothing about the way she handled her tasks, as if she genuinely cared about her patients. It was a stark contrast to the cold calculation he had witnessed earlier. As she adjusted the IV line, Rachel began talking again, her voice soft and melodic. "You know, I've been thinking about what I said yesterday," she admitted, glancing at him briefly. "About how people show their true colors when they think no one's watching. I guess I should take my own advice sometimes." Jason's curiosity piqued. What was she referring to? Was she hinting at something specific, or was she simply reflecting on her own life? He wished he could ask her directly, but he couldn't risk breaking character. Instead, he listened intently, hoping she would reveal more. "I used to work in a different hospital," she continued, her tone growing wistful. "It was bigger, fancier, the kind of place where celebrities and CEOs went for treatment. I thought it would be exciting working there, but it wasn't long before I realized how fake everything was. The doctors only cared about their reputations, and the patients treated us like servants. It felt wrong somehow." Rachel paused, shaking her head as if to clear her thoughts. "Anyway, I decided to leave. This place may not be as glamorous, but at least it feels real. Most of the time, anyway." Her words struck a chord with Jason. He had spent most of his life surrounded by people who wore masks, pretending to be loyal friends or trusted allies while secretly plotting against him. Hearing Rachel talk about authenticity, even in such a simple context, made him realize how rare it truly was. Later that afternoon, Kevin returned to the room, this time alone. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Listen, big brother," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "I hope you can hear me wherever you are. Things are getting complicated, and I need you to pull through soon. Not for me, but for Mom. She's worried sick about you." Jason almost snorted at the mention of their mother. Margaret Coleman had never been the nurturing type. She had always favored Kevin, lavishing him with attention while criticizing Jason relentlessly. If she was worried now, it was likely because she feared losing access to his money. Kevin stopped pacing and leaned closer to the bed. "Look, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye," he admitted, his tone shifting slightly. "But I'm your brother. Blood is thicker than water, right? Just wake up soon, okay? Before Daniel screws everything up." With that, Kevin left the room, leaving Jason to ponder his words. Was his brother genuinely concerned, or was this another act designed to manipulate him? Jason couldn't tell, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. As evening approached, Rachel returned to check on Jason one last time before her shift ended. She seemed distracted, her usual calm demeanor replaced by an air of unease. "You know," she said quietly, sitting down in the chair beside his bed, "sometimes I wonder if anyone really knows who they're dealing with." People put on these faces, these personas, and we buy into them because it's easier than digging deeper. But deep down, everyone has secrets. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Was she talking about him? Did she suspect that he wasn't truly comatose? Or was she simply sharing her thoughts aloud as she often did? Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. Take my ex-husband, for example. He seemed perfect at first. Charming, ambitious, supportive. But after we got married, I saw a different side of him. A side that didn't care about anyone but himself. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He took everything, the house, the savings, even the car. All I was left with was debt and a broken heart. Her confession caught Jason off guard. He hadn't expected her to share something so personal, especially with someone she believed was incapable of responding. Yet there was a raw honesty in her words that resonated with him. He had judged people based on appearances his entire life, assuming they were either allies or enemies. But Rachel's story reminded him that human beings were far more complex than that. When Rachel finally left for the night, Jason lay in silence, processing everything he had heard. His plan to expose the truth about those around him was working, but it was also forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people, to see through their facades and predict their actions. But Rachel was different. She didn't fit neatly into any category, and that unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. For the first time since the accident, Jason began to question whether his deception was worth the cost. Sure, he was learning valuable information about Kevin, Daniel, and others who sought to exploit his condition, but he was also discovering things about himself, things he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The morning after Jason revealed his deception, the hospital room buzzed with activity. Nurses and doctors rushed in, checking his vitals, asking questions, and marveling at his sudden recovery. Word spread quickly through the halls, and soon, visitors began arriving, some out of genuine concern, others with ulterior motives. But Jason's focus remained on Rachel. She stood quietly by the window, her arms crossed as she watched the commotion unfold. "I'm sorry," Jason said finally, breaking the silence between them. His voice was still hoarse, but there was a sincerity in his tone that caught Rachel off guard. "For what?" she asked, turning to face him. Her expression was guarded, though hints of curiosity lingered in her eyes. "For lying to you," he admitted. "For pretending to be someone I wasn't. I thought I needed to do it, to protect myself, but now I realize how wrong I was." Rachel hesitated before responding. "You don't owe me an explanation," she said softly. "We all have our reasons for doing things. What matters is what you do next." Her words struck a chord within Jason. For years he had operated under the belief that success meant control, that if he could anticipate every move, manipulate every situation, he would never be vulnerable again. But Rachel was right. The past couldn't be changed. What mattered was how he chose to move forward. As the day wore on, Jason faced a steady stream of visitors. Kevin arrived first, accompanied by Margaret. Their expressions shifted from shock to suspicion when they realized Jason was awake. Margaret's sharp gaze bore into him while Kevin fidgeted nervously beside her. "Jason," Margaret began, her voice clipped, "we need to discuss the estate. There are arrangements that must be made." "There's nothing to discuss," Jason replied firmly, cutting her off. "I'm not handing over my assets, not to you, not to anyone. If you're here out of concern for my well-being, fine. But if this is about money, save your breath." Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line and Kevin avoided eye contact altogether. They left without another word, their disappointment palpable. It was clear they had expected to capitalize on Jason's condition, and his defiance left them scrambling. Daniel Pierce appeared later, his polished demeanor masking thinly veiled frustration. He tried to charm his way into Jason's good graces, offering vague assurances about loyalty and discretion. But Jason saw through the act. He dismissed Daniel curtly, making it clear that their professional relationship was over. With each interaction, Jason felt a sense of liberation. For so long he had allowed fear and mistrust to dictate his actions, isolating himself from those around him. Now, having confronted the truth about his family and colleagues, he understood that clinging to wealth and power wasn't worth losing his humanity. He wanted something more meaningful, a chance to rebuild his life on his own terms. Rachel stayed by his side throughout the chaos, offering quiet support. When the room finally emptied, she pulled up a chair and sat down beside him. "You handled that well," she said, smiling faintly. "Not many people would stand up to their family like that." "It wasn't easy," Jason admitted, "but I realized something important. I've spent my whole life protecting myself from being hurt. In the process, I pushed away everyone who might have cared about me, including you." Rachel looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying thank you. For everything. You didn't have to care about me, but you did. You treated me like a person, not a paycheck. That means more to me than you know." Rachel nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I just did my job," she said modestly. "But I'll admit, you surprised me. Most people wouldn't risk exposing themselves like that. Why did you decide to stop pretending?" Jason took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Because I realized I was missing the point. My plan was supposed to uncover the truth about others, but it ended up showing me the truth about myself. I've been so focused on controlling everything that I forgot how to trust people. Until now." There was a pause, the kind that hangs heavy in the air, filled with unspoken understanding. Finally, Rachel spoke. "So what happens next? For you, I mean." "That depends," Jason replied, meeting her gaze. "On whether you'd consider giving me a second chance to prove that I'm not the man I used to be." Rachel smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face. "Second chances are hard to come by," she said, "but I think you've earned one." Over the next few days, Jason worked with the hospital staff to finalize his discharge plans. As part of his recovery, he decided to take a step back from his business empire, at least temporarily. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to prioritize his health and well-being over profit margins and boardroom politics. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt right. Before leaving the hospital, Jason approached Rachel one last time. She was tidying up the nurse's station, organizing charts and updating records. When she noticed him standing nearby, she straightened up and turned to face him. "I wanted to give you this," Jason said, handing her a small envelope. Inside was a check made out to her son's school, along with a note explaining that it covered tuition and extracurricular fees for the year. Rachel stared at the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. "Jason, I can't accept this," she protested, shaking her head. "It's too much." "It's not charity," he insisted. "Think of it as an investment. Your son deserves every opportunity to succeed. And besides, I owe you for teaching me something valuable." "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That sometimes the best thing we can do is let go of the past and start over." Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she clutched the envelope tightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Jason nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "No, thank you for reminding me what really matters." With that, he turned and walked toward the exit, his steps lighter than they had been in years. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting golden light across the parking lot. Jason paused for a moment, taking it all in. The fresh air, the open sky, the promise of new beginnings. He didn't know exactly where his journey would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. As Rachel watched him leave from the hospital window, she smiled to herself. Jason Coleman wasn't perfect. In fact, he was far from it. But he had shown her something remarkable, the capacity for change. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days blurred together for Jason Coleman, each one a mix of silence, observation, and growing unease. His plan to feign a coma had given him access to secrets he might never have uncovered otherwise, but it was also beginning to take its toll. The more he listened, the more he realized how deeply rooted betrayal and greed were in his life. And yet amidst all the deceit, there was Rachel Dawson, a constant presence who seemed immune to the corruption that surrounded him. Rachel's shifts became something Jason looked forward to, though he couldn't explain why. She wasn't like the others, his family, his business partners, or even the strangers who occasionally visited his room out of curiosity. She didn't try to use him for her gain, or hide behind false smiles. Instead, she spoke openly, sharing pieces of herself, without expecting anything in return. It was unsettling in a way because it forced Jason to confront emotions he hadn't felt in years: empathy, vulnerability, and perhaps even trust. One evening, as Rachel adjusted the curtains to let in the fading sunlight, she began talking again. "You know," she said softly, her back turned to him as she worked, "I've been thinking a lot about second chances lately. Life doesn't always give them, but when it does, you have to grab onto them with both hands." Jason's ears perked up. Second chances? Was she speaking metaphorically, or was this another glimpse into her past? He kept his breathing steady, careful not to betray any sign of consciousness. "I made so many mistakes," Rachel continued, her voice tinged with regret. "After my divorce, I thought I'd never recover. I lost everything, not just material things, but my confidence, my sense of self-worth. For a long time, I convinced myself that I deserved it, that I wasn't good enough to fight back." She paused, turning to face him. Her expression was soft, almost wistful, as if she were seeing something beyond the motionless figure lying in the bed. "But then I realized something important. You can't change what happened, but you can decide how you move forward. That's what I'm trying to do now, one step at a time." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jason felt a pang of guilt as he listened. Here was someone who had endured real hardship, who had fought tooth and nail to rebuild her life from the ground up. Meanwhile, he had spent years accumulating wealth and power, only to find himself isolated and distrusted by nearly everyone around him. What did that say about him? Had he squandered his own chance at happiness by prioritizing success over relationships? As the night wore on, Rachel stayed longer than usual, tidying up the room and making notes on his chart. She seemed distracted, her movements slower and less deliberate than usual. Finally, she sat down in the chair beside his bed, resting her elbows on her knees and leaning forward slightly. "There's something I haven't told anyone," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not even my closest friends. When my ex left me, I hit rock bottom. I mean, really hit it. There were nights when I didn't think I'd make it through to the next day, but somehow, I did. And now, looking back, I realize that those dark times taught me something valuable." She hesitated, glancing at Jason as if weighing whether to continue. Then, taking a deep breath, she added, "They taught me that no matter how bad things get, there's always hope. Even if you can't see it right away, it's there, waiting for you to reach out and grab it." Jason's chest tightened. He wanted to sit up, to tell her that he understood, that he too was searching for hope in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. But he couldn't. Not yet. He had to stay focused on his plan, no matter how much it hurt to keep pretending. The next morning brought a new visitor, Margaret Coleman, Jason's mother. She swept into the room like a storm cloud, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. Her sharp features were framed by perfectly styled silver hair, and her expensive suit screamed wealth and authority. Kevin trailed behind her, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact with his brother. Margaret stopped at the foot of the bed, staring down at Jason with an unreadable expression. "Well," she said after a moment, her tone clipped, "this is quite the mess you've gotten yourself into, isn't it?" Kevin shifted awkwardly, clearly uneasy under his mother's scrutiny. "Mom, maybe we should wait until later." "Nonsense," Margaret interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "If your brother can hear us, he needs to understand the gravity of the situation. This accident has caused chaos in the family, and we need answers." Jason resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Chaos in the family? Hardly. If anything, his supposed coma had exposed the cracks that had been there all along. Still, he remained silent, listening intently. Margaret turned to Kevin, her gaze hardening. "Have you spoken to Daniel about the will?" she asked pointedly. "We need to ensure that everything is in order before Jason wakes up, or worse, decides to make changes." "Mom, please," Kevin protested weakly. "Can't we just focus on his recovery?" "Recovery?" Margaret snapped, her voice rising. "Don't be naive, Kevin. Your brother has always been reckless, putting his business ahead of everything else. Look where that's gotten him." She gestured toward the bed, her lips curling into a sneer. "No, we need to protect the family's interests. That's what matters most." Jason's fists clenched beneath the blanket. Protect the family's interests? As far as he could tell, his mother cared only about protecting her access to his money. She had never supported him emotionally, never celebrated his achievements or comforted him during his failures. Now faced with the possibility of losing her financial safety net, she was willing to trample over her own son without hesitation. When Margaret finally left, dragging Kevin with her, Jason felt a wave of bitterness wash over him. He had known his family was flawed, but hearing their true feelings laid bare was still jarring. It reinforced why he had embarked on this charade in the first place, to uncover the truth about those closest to him. Unfortunately, the truth was uglier than he had imagined. Later that afternoon, Rachel returned to the room, her demeanor lighter than it had been the previous night. She greeted him warmly, humming softly as she went about her duties. When she finished, she pulled up a chair and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "You know," she said, smiling faintly, "I like to imagine that you're listening to me, even if you can't respond. It makes me feel less alone in a way." Jason's heart ached at her words. Less alone. That was exactly how he felt whenever she spoke to him, like he wasn't trapped in this sterile room, cut off from the rest of the world. Her presence was a lifeline, tethering him to reality when everything else seemed hollow and distant. "I wonder sometimes," Rachel mused, tilting her head slightly, "what it must be like to be in your position, to wake up and find everyone watching you, waiting for you to make a decision. Do you think people would treat you differently if they knew you could hear them?" Jason didn't have an answer, but the question lingered in his mind long after. Rachel left for the night. Would people treat him differently? Probably. But would it matter? After everything he had heard, he wasn't sure he trusted anyone anymore, not even himself. As the hours passed, Jason found himself reflecting on Rachel's earlier confession. She had spoken about second chances, about finding hope in the darkest moments. Maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe this ordeal wasn't just about exposing the truth. Maybe it was also about giving him a chance to start over, to become someone better. For the first time since the accident, Jason allowed himself to entertain the idea of letting go of his bitterness, of forgiving those who had wronged him, and of forgiving himself. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. And if Rachel could find the strength to rebuild her life, then surely he could do the same. Jason Coleman's resolve was growing stronger with each passing day. The charade he had started to uncover the truth about those around him had turned into something more profound, a journey of self-discovery. He had seen the worst in people: greed, betrayal, and selfishness. But he had also glimpsed something unexpected: hope, resilience, and perhaps even redemption in Rachel Dawson. Late one night, as the hospital grew quiet and the halls dimmed, Jason lay still in his bed pretending to be comatose. Rachel entered the room softly, her sneakers making no sound against the tiled floor. She carried a small notebook in one hand and a pen in the other, her expression thoughtful. Setting the items down on the bedside table, she adjusted the IV line and checked his vitals. Everything seemed normal, but there was something different about her tonight. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, as if she were weighing every action before taking it. "You know," she began, settling into the chair beside his bed, "I've been thinking a lot about you lately." Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Not just because you're my patient, but because, well, I don't know. There's something about you that feels different. Like you're not really as lost as everyone thinks. Jason's heart skipped a beat. Was she onto him? Had she somehow figured out that he wasn't truly unconscious? He kept his breathing steady, careful not to give himself away. I mean, look at you, Rachel continued, gesturing toward his motionless form. You're lying here perfectly still like you're waiting for something. Maybe you are, or maybe... She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. Never mind. It's probably nothing. Jason exhaled silently, relieved that she hadn't pressed further. But her words stuck with him. She was observant, far more than he had given her credit for. If she suspected anything, it wouldn't take much for her to piece the truth together. Did he want her to find out? Or was it better to keep up the act until he had gathered all the information he needed? The next morning brought another visitor. Daniel Pierce, Jason's lawyer. Unlike Margaret or Kevin, Daniel didn't bother pretending to care about Jason's well-being. He walked into the room briskly, closing the door behind him with a sharp click. Pulling out a folder from his briefcase, he sat down in the chair near the window and spread the papers across the small table. All right, Jason, Daniel said, under his breath, glancing at the bed to ensure no one was watching. Let's get this sorted. Your brother and mother have been pushing hard to gain control of your assets. They think they can manipulate me into filing the paperwork without your consent, but I'm smarter than that. Jason fought the urge to snort. Smarter? Hardly. Daniel was cunning, yes, but loyalty wasn't part of his vocabulary. He would side with whoever offered the most money, and Jason knew it. For now, Daniel continued, flipping through the documents. I've managed to stall them, but we both know how these things work. If you don't wake up soon, they'll find a way to bypass me. And trust me, you won't like what happens next. He leaned back in the chair, tapping a pen against the edge of the table. So here's what I propose. When you finally decide to open your eyes, and I know you will, you let me handle everything. I'll make sure your family doesn't get their hands on a single penny. Of course, there will be certain arrangements we'll need to discuss. Let's just say my services don't come cheap. With that, Daniel stood up, gathering the papers and slipping them back into his briefcase. He gave Jason one last glance before leaving the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Jason clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath the surface. Even Daniel, who claimed to be on his side, was looking out for himself. No one could be trusted, not completely. Later that afternoon, Rachel returned to check on Jason. She seemed distracted, her usual calm demeanor replaced by an air of tension. As she adjusted the blankets covering him, she sighed quietly, her shoulders slumping slightly. You know, she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I wonder why I stay here. This job, it's not easy. The hours are long. The pay isn't great, and some days it feels like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough. She paused, staring out the window at the gray sky beyond. But then I think about patients like you, people who are fighting battles we can't see. Maybe you're not aware of what's happening right now, but someday when you wake up, you'll remember the little things, the way someone cared for you, the way they treated you with kindness. That matters, doesn't it? Her words struck a chord deep within Jason. For years, he had surrounded himself with people who saw him as a means to an end, who valued him only for his wealth and influence. Yet here was Rachel, pouring her energy into caring for him, not because she expected anything in return, but because it was simply the right thing to do. It was humbling, and it made him question whether his plan to deceive everyone was worth the cost. That night, as the hospital grew quiet once more, Jason found himself wrestling with doubt. His initial goal had been clear: expose the truth about those around him and protect his fortune. But now, after weeks of listening to Rachel's confessions and observing the selfishness of others, he wasn't so sure anymore. What if his deception was causing more harm than good? What if the real lesson he was meant to learn wasn't about betrayal, but about connection? The turning point came unexpectedly. It was late, past midnight, and the hospital was eerily silent. Rachel entered the room, her face pale and drawn. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed as though she'd been crying. Setting her clipboard down on the desk, she sank into the chair beside Jason's bed, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My son, he's struggling in school. He's being bullied, and I can't afford to send him somewhere else. Every time I think I'm getting ahead, something happens to pull me back down. It's like I'm trapped in this cycle and I don't know how to break free." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she spoke, her body shaking with quiet sobs. Jason's chest tightened. He had never seen Rachel like this, so raw, so vulnerable. In that moment, he realized that the walls he had built around himself weren't protecting him. They were isolating him. He couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't, not when it meant shutting out the one person who had shown him genuine kindness. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jason blinked deliberately, catching Rachel's attention. At first, she froze, unsure if she had imagined the movement. Then slowly, he opened his eyes and locked gazes with her. Shock registered on her face, followed by confusion and disbelief. "Rachel?" he croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. I can hear you." For a moment, neither of them moved. Rachel stared at him, her mouth agape, as if trying to process what had just happened. Finally, she dropped the clipboard she was holding and rushed to call the doctor. When they were alone again, Jason apologized for pretending to be unconscious. To his surprise, Rachel didn't react with anger or betrayal. Instead, she smiled faintly and admitted, "I knew something wasn't right. You were too still, too perfect. Like, you weren't really asleep." Their conversation deepened as Jason explained his reasons for the charade. Rachel listened intently, sharing her perspective without judgment. Together they formed an unspoken bond, built on honesty and mutual understanding. By the time morning arrived, Jason felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had started this journey seeking answers, but what he had found instead was something far more valuable, a chance to start over. And for the first time in years, he believed that maybe, just maybe, he could.